The neighbors grow increasingly concerned as an unbearable odor emanates from the house nearby, and their apprehension intensifies upon uncovering the shocking truth. There was an old house on the corner of Garson and Madison Streets, a big yellow house with a steep roof and lots of chimneys. It must once have been a lovely, welcoming place, but now its paint was flaking off and some of the roof tiles were missing. The steps up to the porch were warped, and you could see that it had been a long time since anyone had bothered to mow the lawn or trim the hedges, and even the white picket fence was missing slats, like a mouth without teeth. Once, the grown-ups said, that house had been the pride of the neighborhood, and the owners, Mr. and Mrs. Curzon, had won prizes with their roses, and the delicious scent of fresh-baked cookies was always in the air. Now things were very different. Mr. Curzon had passed away, and the couple's two grown-up sons had moved in, supposedly to take care of their mother, but when they were around, they seemed to spend all their time drinking beer on the porch in their undershirts. As for Mrs. Curzon, she very rarely came outside anymore, and when she did, she looked very pale and weak and leaned on the arm of one of her unfriendly sons so that people were afraid to greet her or strike up a conversation. This all went on for a long time until something changed. One day, Tommy Garcia and his friend Fred Halloran were bicycling past the house when they smelled something weird. Tommy stopped and looked back at the yellow house over his shoulder. "That's really weird," he said to Fred. "Smells bad, like a dead rat." "Dead rat?" scoffed Fred. "More like a dead buffalo." "That's disgusting. How can anyone live in there?" asked Tommy. "Well, I don't think anyone is living in there," said Fred. "I saw the Curzon boys drive away in that fancy truck of theirs a week ago." "Oh," Tommy frowned. "But what about old Lady Curzon?" Fred's eyes grew big and round, and he leaned to whisper, "Maybe they killed her and buried her in the basement, and that's what we're smelling." "No way!" cried Tommy, his eyes shining with excitement. "A murder right in our street? And if we're the ones to find the dead body, that would be totally sick," exclaimed Fred. The two boys leaned their bikes against the Curzon's rickety fence and crept up to the front door. Tommy rang the bell, but no one answered. They peered into the front windows, into a living room so full of dust and empty bottles of beer they could hardly see the furniture. "Let's go round back," Tommy said. "Maybe the door will be open." The closer they were to the house, the stronger the stench, and Fred was holding his nose. "Maybe we should just go home," he said to Tommy, but Tommy was already standing on tiptoe, peeking into the kitchen window. "Fred," he cried, "quick, call your dad. Call 911. "What?" asked Fred excitedly. "Is there a dead body?" "No," said Tommy, climbing up onto the window ledge and pushing it open. "Mrs. Curzon is on the floor, and I think she's hurt real bad." Tommy jumped into the kitchen and ran to Mrs. Curzon's side. The frail lady was pale and her eyes were closed. Something about the way her leg was turned was very strange and made Tommy feel kind of sick. "Mrs. Curzon," he asked, "can you hear me?" Tommy placed his hand on Mrs. Curzon's forehead, and it felt like it was burning. He went to the tap and filled up a beaker and brought her back the water. Gently, he lifted up Mrs. Curzon's head and wet her lips with the water. Mrs. Curzon opened her eyes. She tried to speak, but Tommy hushed her. "Help is on the way," he said, and it was. Before long, the police and the paramedics were there, and what they found appalled them. From what they could see, Mrs. Curzon's sons had locked her inside her own house and left her all alone. The old lady had apparently slipped and fell, breaking her hip. The police later found her cell phone upstairs, out of reach. She could never have managed to crawl up the steep steps. Mrs. Curzon was taken to the hospital, and just in time. The doctors said she was in the last stages of dehydration and wouldn't have survived much longer. The smell that Tommy and Fred had noticed came from a smashed sewer pipe, and in fact, the whole house was in disrepair. When the police gently questioned Mrs. Curzon, she explained, "My sons wanted to go on a vacation, but I said I wasn't staying there by myself, so they locked me in." "They locked you in?" asked the police officer. "Against your will?" Mrs. Curzon blushed. "They did leave me food, you know, but then the sewer pipe broke and I tried to fix it and I fell. I managed to drag myself to the kitchen, but I couldn't get outside because of the locks." As soon as the Curzon boys' misdeeds came to light, the police swiftly obtained a warrant for their arrest. Witnessing the state of their mother's ravaged home left the neighbors horrified. In a remarkable display of unity, the entire neighborhood rallied together, dedicating themselves to restoring, repairing, and embellishing every inch of the house. Some of the compassionate women even adorned the old garden with vibrant roses. By the time Mrs. Curzon returned from the hospital, she was greeted with a sight reminiscent of the house's former beauty. Blooming flowers filled the garden, and Tommy, Fred, and the other children had adorned the ancient trees with countless colorful balloons. Overwhelmed with emotion, Mrs. Curzon couldn't hold back tears of gratitude as she expressed her heartfelt thanks to everyone involved. Tommy felt a deep sense of pride in being able to offer his assistance. As for the Curzon boys, they ultimately received a 5-year prison sentence for their actions against their own mother.